Just real quickly, last week, Pastor Bob was talking on stewardship principles for kingdom living. Remember, we mostly talked about the parable of the talents from Mark 25, where the master gave talents to one servant and then another servant and the third servant. And the first two, they went out and multiplied it, and the last one kind of buried in the ground. And he dealt with them based on what they had done with those resources. So that's kind of sets the tone for how we approach the resources that God gives us in this life. How did everybody do with practical applications from the end of last week's chapter? Goals for my life and God's resources. Did y'all get a chance to work on those? This is a really, I want to encourage you to do these exercises. They're really great because, I mean, especially with this one, it lets you begin to have a discussion with God about things like your standard of living that you want to have for your life, that you feel is appropriate between you and God. Some goals for giving, for sowing into the work of the kingdom. Goals for saving and investment for life, what you want to see in the future. I mean, it's good to dream a little bit like this with God. Have a discussion with Him about it. Because, I was in the military for 20 years, and they have this great little statement that they say before they do anything. We go in and we do all this planning and everything to execute plans and programs. And, this one thing that they always told us was failing to plan means you plan to fail. So that's why some of these exercises are really good to go through after we meet together and after you do some of the reading and stuff, is because you get to start to plan with God. He makes pretty good plans. I mean, He created everything in 7 days. 6 days, and then He rested. That's a pretty good plan. I have a hard enough time making anything in a week. God did it. He did everything in a week, so I kind of want to plan with Him. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about, we're in week 3. We're going to talk about a culture of debt. And if you're following along in your workbook, that chapter starts on page 28. But debt's a big deal. How many of you know that? That's a big deal. Our culture right now that we live in, it kind of treats debt like a status symbol. And we use it to determine someone's value and worth. The more stuff you have, the better you are. I mean, that's kind of how our culture looks at it. They tend to look at it like that. It's all over the media. It's everywhere you go. Billboards, TV. There's TVs in the grocery store now. Hey, you want to buy our stuff? Because it'll make you better. That's how culture kind of approaches it. And this is the message that continues to be sent out to us every day. But you know what? God's kingdom is upside down. It's completely different from that. So we have to shift the way that we think and the way that we approach things. In the kingdom, financial debt is highlighted for its pitfalls and dangers. Debt's dangerous. And I'm not making this up. I'm not. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, "For the love of money," we do have a verse for it. "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Debt and grief. Yeah, I can attest that goes hand in hand. I'm not just speaking out of one side of my mouth either. I've been there. In 2007, the military moved us from Nebraska to Texas, and we owned a house. And the military doesn't have a buyback program. So we went through a year of adjudication while we lived in Texas, trying to rent our house, not being able to rent our house. We couldn't sell it. The market, that was right when the market tanked. Everything went horrible for everybody across the nation. And we worked with the bank. We tried to figure out a way, maybe do a short sale and still have everything be okay. Maybe trade give the house back to the bank. They wouldn't work with us at all. And it wound up going to foreclosure. And because of that, it wrecked the rest of our credit. And we started getting those pleasantly wonderful phone calls. Hey, you owe us money. Give us our money. It was a wonderful time. I'm being a little sarcastic. Obviously, it was rough. We saw consumer debt go from we had a really low percentage rate because we were working to pay it off, because we had just gone through financial classes and we set a goal to pay off our debt, and the enemy just wanted to come in and steal that. We saw our percentage rates go from 1.5%, 2% on our consumer debt to 33% overnight. And it was horrendously difficult to deal with. We wound up in 2008 starting a bankruptcy process. We filed for bankruptcy in 2009. We've been through it. So I know that debt in this country is a huge obstacle. It's a huge issue that we deal with. I've been there. It like it says in Timothy, it pierces us with many griefs. Yes, it does. But you see, in God's upside-down kingdom, He teaches us to have a different viewpoint of debt. In our memory verse this week, it's Romans 13:8. He actually tells us that the only debt, the only obligation we should have is that to love others. Romans 13:8 says, don't be in debt to anyone. That's pretty clear to me. Don't be in debt to anyone. Except for the obligation to love each other. Whoever loves another person has fulfilled the law. We're called to be just like our Father. We're called to be just like Christ. That's the debt that we owe. We owe a debt of love to others. So it's a shift in the way that we think about debt. It's not about money anymore. It's about our heart attitudes. It's about our relationship with God and others. But let's talk some practical things, though. Let's get a little practical tonight. How on earth do we deal with debt? That is the $1 million question. If I had $1 million, it would make things a lot easier sometimes, I think. But it's a real practical question for us. Let's look at the debt in our nation. The debt that we deal with, I'm talking government debt, business debt, personal financial debt, it's enormous. It's staggering when you look at the numbers. I was just online today looking at some government websites. In 1960, our government debt was $543 billion. Okay, 57 years later, in 2017, our government debt was $19 trillion. So it's like everybody thinks we should just take the money out and just, hey, have money. That's kind of how we approach it in this culture. Is we just think it's all there. We just let's just spend it. Let's do let's borrow against tomorrow. And so it's a huge issue for so many people. The top reasons cited for divorce are emotional, physical, and financial breach of trust. Debt and finances are one of the top 3 things that lead to divorce in our nation. Debt breaks relationships, guys. Financial debt and unrestrained spending and unwise choices, those it causes so much grief and turmoil. I know it sounds bad up front. Hey, the banks are pretty smart. They really are. They know that if they can get you to pay interest for borrowing their money, because that's what you're doing. You're borrowing someone else's money to spend. They know that if they can get you to pay, that they can make millions. There's a chart on page 31 in the workbook, which is it's just really basic, but it's pretty incredible. And it's looking at interest and debt payments over 40 years. Because we're all playing the long game. You don't get out of life at the beginning, usually. You get out at the end. So it's a long game. So you kind of need to approach many things in life with that idea in mind. I need to look at 20 years down the road. I need to look at 40 years down the road. Just to be practical with things. So if you look at this chart, you'll see how much, if you just have some debt and you're paying on it, let's say you pay $1,000 in interest each year, really low amount. You know, over 40 years, a bank will make over $4 million on that interest if you're just paying $1,000 in interest every year. 40 years, they'll make $4 million. That's crazy. Because they're charging you on the money that you borrowed. You're putting that money in their pocket. Whereas if you took $1,000 a year and maybe saved it or invested it at a moderate rate of return, you could make close to $1 million over the course of that time for yourself. There is a concept in the kingdom about this faithfulness and stewardship, and Pastor Bob talked about it a lot in the last session last week. There is one of the 7 financial principles he went over is that concept of seed time and harvest. What you sow is what you will reap. You got to be in it for the long game. He talked about his life growing up in Iowa. I spent a lot of years in Nebraska. They grow corn. They grow a lot of corn. I watched it. You see the farmers out there. I knew exactly what he was talking about last year or last week, because you see the farmers out there at the beginning of the year. They plant the crops, and you just watch it, and the field's brown for months, and then suddenly it turns green. When you turn your back, you turn back around, you're like, oh my gosh, there's all this growth coming out of the ground, and then a couple months later, it's like over your head, and it's crazy. But they get this concept of seed time. And then they take care of it as it grows, and then they reap a harvest at the end. So the banks understand this. They're in it for the long game. There's banks that have been out, they've been in business for hundreds of years, some of them. So they get this idea of the long game. Do you? Do we? We really need to start thinking long term. The Bible, amazingly enough, there's over 2,000 verses in Scripture about finances and possessions. That's a lot. The only thing Jesus spoke more about in the Gospels than finances was the kingdom. This is a big topic. But remarkably, the Bible is relatively silent when it comes to giving us wisdom and advice on when it is acceptable to borrow money. It talks about what to do if you borrow money. So, God's already knowing that these transactions are going to go on because he talks about what we do with it. The biggest focus in this is that we have a responsibility to meet our obligations. You can't just hide your head in the sand. We're not ostriches. We have to face life. We have to go through it. We have to deal with what we owe. But we have to have the right perspective and relationship to debt. That's what the Bible focuses on. That's what God focuses on. That's why he says, be in debt to no one except for the continuing obligation to love your neighbor. So really, God is more interested in where your heart is in relationship with debt than where your pocketbook is, where your bank account is. There are practical things that you can do to get out of debt. How many of you know that? And it's not playing the lottery. There's actual things that we can do to get out of debt. They're in the workbook on pages 72 or 32 through 35, but I just want to go through some of them. The biggest one, the number one thing we should do, that's pray. That's part of planning with God. We've got to start talking with Him. God is a provider. He owns the gold in the mountains, the cattle on 1,000 hills. There is no lack. In the kingdom, the roads are paved with gold. I mean, just think about how many roads there are in this city. What if all of that was gold? Wow, I mean, all the financial problems would be gone like that. But God doesn't work that way. So you've got to talk to Him and say, God, what's your plan for me? And we have examples of this in Scripture. In 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a story which I'm just going to describe to you, so we're not going to read the whole thing, but it's a widow. Her husband dies and leaves her with debt. And the debt collectors come and they say, we're going to sell your children to pay off the debt. We're going to sell your children to pay off the debt. She was in a bind. She was pierced with grievances. Oh my goodness, debt is not a good thing. And she went to the prophet Elijah and she said, I need some help. What do I do? Let's talk with God. What should I do? And Elijah, he comes back with this great response. God's answers are never what we expect. Elijah says to her, he's like, okay, what do you own? She said, I have a jar of oil. Elijah said, okay, go to all your friends, borrow all the jars and containers that you can. Then go home and pour out that jar into the other containers. Okay, this is a lot like 5 loaves and 2 fish. God's math to feed 20,000 people. Sometimes it doesn't add up to our minds. That's why we need to talk with God. That's why we pray. That's why we go to Him and say, God, what's your plan? This widow did what Elijah asked. She went into her house and she started pouring from that jar of oil. And she didn't stop until she ran out of containers. And she went, I have no more containers, and the oil stopped. So how much faith do we have? How many containers are we going to borrow to fill up with God's resources? Because that oil didn't come from her little jar. It came from God. So, we've got to start there. We've got to start with God. We've got to make those plans with Him first. The second practical thing you can do is sell stuff. If you don't need it and you're not using it, why hold on to it? You're not taking it with you. You might as well let somebody else get some good use out of it and get some financial return from it. That's what this widow did. She poured out all the oil. She went and sold the oil and she paid off her creditors. So, if you don't really need it, sell it. Pare down. Get creative. Hey, if you haven't worn something in your wardrobe, or if you haven't used something that's in your cabinets for the last year, chances are you're probably not going to. That might be a good thing to consider selling. I'm just saying that's a great place to start. You may not need that thing if you haven't used it. And I've been there. We've done that. Craigslist, eBay, yard sale, you name it. If you can take some of that resource that God's put in your house and put it to work, you're not using it, put it to work and pay off those debts, do it. What's stopping you? Another thing you can do is actually make a plan to pay off your debts. It's great to say, I'm going to pay off my debts. My wife and I did this for years. We're going to pay off our debt. But we didn't actually do it until we had a plan for paying off our debt. Our second problem was we didn't have a plan for staying out of debt. So you gotta make plans to pay off your debts, and you gotta make the plan to stay that way too. Write it all down. Decide which one you're going to tackle first. There's a couple of different ways to do it. I mean, there's some suggestions in the workbook. We'll talk about it in a later talk. Actually, it's the next one. Has anybody ever heard of a debt snowball? Have you ever seen an avalanche? This is what a debt snowball is. You want to avalanche your debts with God's resources. But how does it start? It doesn't start with all of the snow at first. It only starts with something small. So one of the ways you can bury your debt in an avalanche is you can start small. Maybe pick a debt that you owe that's small and pay until you pay it all. I mean, focus your intensity on paying that down until it's no more. Because you know what? Once you pay it off, you're like, yes, I can do this. God, thank you. We can do this. God, you because He gives you the power to succeed. He's made us overcomers. Debt is just another thing to overcome. And really, folks, start with your consumer debt. That's often the one with the highest interest rates. That's the one where the lenders make the most off of you because they will and they can. And really, usually with consumer debt, you have nothing to show for it after you've spent it. That's just an unfortunate truth, and I can attest to that. Been there, done that. Wish I hadn't spent somebody else's money. I'd rather it was my own. Another thing you can do is earn some extra income. I mean, there's nothing stopping you from doing extra work. Really, there may be some things that you have to consider about the way your life is, but we do have time that's free that we can focus on these things. And maybe it's as simple as walking dogs in your neighborhood when you get home from work in the evening. Hey, I'm telling you, an extra $20 or $30 a week can go a long way if you make it work for you. Consider don't be too proud to go. It's kind of hard to do it here, but don't be too proud to go mow lawns on the weekends. I know there's not a lot of grass in the desert. But when I was a kid, that's what we used to do to make pocket money, right? You get mom and dad's lawnmower and the gas can. You walk around the neighborhood, knock on doors. Hey, do you need your lawn mowed? There's nothing stopping you from doing things like that. Talking to your neighbors and say, hey, do you have any odd jobs around the house that you need done? Landscaping. There's nothing wrong with digging ditches to make some extra money. I've done it. I've done that too. Hard work is good for us. It really is. And it builds character. I like to tell my kids that. But it's true. So why shouldn't I apply it? And if you're in a household and you really want to tackle your debt and you want a landslide to bury it, don't be afraid to get everybody involved. Don't be afraid to say, how are we all going to pitch in to take care of this? Because God is about community. And if you live in a household, there's nothing wrong with cooperating. God draws us into community so we can cooperate with Him. Let's work with the people around us too. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to ask your family to pitch in, especially when they're using the water and the electricity and eating out of the fridge the same as you are. I'm just saying, it's great when everybody pitches in. One of the biggest things you can do is control the plastic. I know it's uncommon in today's culture, but there's something about spending with cash. When you have cash in your hand, you suddenly see where it's going, and then you go, why is it all gone? And there's something inside that happens to you when you're like, this is my last $5 bill. I don't want to break it. You start to see what happens to your money in a very physical and real way when you have to touch it. When it goes from your employer to the bank to the store, and you never see any green bills in your hand or your wallet, it's like it's magic. I have more. I'll just spend. And that's what has happened in our culture. I know, because I fell into that trap early in our marriage. We had out of control spending when we first got married, because I didn't learn these principles at home when I was a kid, and I certainly didn't have any good Christians mentoring me about my financial obligations and how to meet them. And so, thank God I was in the military with a good job that had a re-enlistment bonus, because when it got time to re-enlist, we used that extra money to pay off debt. We didn't use that extra money to go on a vacation, although that would have been really nice. We paid off debt because we'd been irresponsible. And at least 3 or 4 times in our 23 years of marriage, my wife and I have gone to financial counseling. The military was really great when you first come in. They make you go to a financial class. They help you try to learn how to manage your money, but you've got to apply it. But it's really cold. It's it's a checklist and things to follow. And it's like, if you do this, it'll be good. If you do this, it'll be good. And there's no real dealing with your attitudes towards money. And that's why we wound up in trouble. And so then we started looking for other classes. We wound up doing financial planning by Larry Burkett, which was Christian-based. We've been through Financial Peace University with Dave Ramsey, with Dave Ramsey's program like twice in our marriage. We did a Crown Financial program, which is another kingdom-based financial program. And it took us that long to kind of get our head on straight. So I'm not expecting you guys to be wizards after tonight with finances. I don't expect you to go start working on Wall Street. Actually, I don't recommend that either. Unless God has gifted you for that and called you to it. The best thing you can do is cultivate an attitude of contentment. Learn to be content. Do you realize America is the wealthiest nation on earth? Even the poorest in our cities are more wealthy than the majority of the rest of the world. Because for the most part, everybody in America at least eats once a day. Most of us, the majority of us, have some place to sleep at night, and we have clothes to wear. And the majority of the world, they can't say those 3 things. We're wealthy. So we should be thankful for that. Don't let marketing and advertising convince you that you don't have enough. I mean, here it's great. The advertisers are onto something. They know the more that you watch something on any kind of media, the more that you read magazines or newspapers, or you go on you go on your smartphone. They know the more ads that they get in front of you, the more you're going to shop, and the more you shop, the more you're going to spend. Because you're going to begin to feel dissatisfied, because you go and you buy it and you bring it home and you're like, well, that didn't make me happy. I must need more. But when you learn to be content with what you have and you're thankful for what God has already provided, your perspective really changes. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. This is very interesting what Paul had to say to Timothy. He said, there is constant bickering between people whose minds are ruined and who have been robbed of the truth. They think that godliness is a way to make money. Actually, godliness is a great source of profit when it is combined with being happy with what you already have. See, Marketers, advertisers, they've learned this. If they can bombard you with a message enough, you begin to believe it. You become robbed of the truth, which is you already have enough. And you begin to believe, I don't have enough. But this is really interesting in verse 6 when he says, godliness really is a great source of profit when you put it together, when you combine it with being happy with what you already have. We have so much. When we become happy, God, thank you that I had breakfast today. God, thank you for lunch. When you begin to cultivate that attitude of thankfulness, you really do begin to profit. Because then you're like, wow, there's extra food too? That's so awesome. It changes your whole perspective. Hey, get radical in the way that you live. Can I encourage you to do that? This is one of those things you can do. Consider changing your standard of living. What you decide your standard of living is, that is your standard of living. I know in America, we do have to set some things. I mean, in most cities, we don't have great public transportation, so you kind of do need access to transportation. So part of your standard of living may be, I do need a car. Okay, that's fine. But determine what it is, and don't let the culture sway you to think that it needs to be something different. Like what can you be content with? Can I be content with, I like to call it my ABC cars. It gets me from point A to point B, see? That was my ABC car. I was interested when I was working in getting an ABC car. I didn't need a Cadillac. I needed a car to get me to work and home. And so I don't think in my life I've ever owned a new car. Just because that's the way that it worked out and we decided we can't afford it. But get radical. I mean, there are a lot of people who will do some radical things to eliminate debt. My family, we've done some radical things in the past, and usually when we get to that point where we know we need to do something radical, we call it beans and rice time. And we will eat beans and rice a lot. Because it's inexpensive and you can make a lot and everybody's satisfied. They don't go to bed hungry. So there's nothing wrong with getting radical and doing that. Yes, it gets plain, it gets bland. But you know what? Your grocery bill shrinks when you do radical stuff like that. We've had to do that before. I didn't join the military ever to make money. That was not my goal when I joined the military. And you know what? When I decided to come and work for God's kingdom, that wasn't my goal either. He wants to bless us, but where you set your sights and your attitudes, it does impact how you live your life. And when you make choices like that, we're going to get radical with our grocery budget this month. God can really bless that and multiply it because it's like, it's food. God, thank you for putting food on the table. Amen. Do something really wild. Maybe you downsize your house. I know I'm just radical. I know. Maybe you sell that car and get an ABC car. Maybe you don't need 3 cars. I mean, if you need 3 cars, you need 3 cars. I'm not going to begrudge anybody owning what they need to make it in America, in this culture. But I'm asking that we just examine what we really do need. Get with God and say, God, what do we really need? And what should I be satisfied with? What am I satisfied with? And the last thing that practical things that you can do is don't give up. Don't give up. I mean, getting out of debt is hard work. I don't care if you have a little bit of debt or a mountain of debt. It's hard work because nobody knows what your life is like except for you, your closest friends and family, and God. So that's why you need to take it to him. But don't give up. It's hard work. You've got to keep pressing in to see the breakthrough. You've got to sow to reap. Galatians 6:9, I love it in the New King James Version. It says, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not lose heart. In due season, when it's fully grown, we're going to reap. You know, I like sci-fi. There's this one movie that I particularly like, and my kids, they have gotten to the point where they can repeat this after me. There's this one character in Galaxy Quest, Jason Nesmith. He's the captain of this starship, and this movie's like a spoof on Star Trek. So this is the captain of the ship, and he always says, never give up, never surrender. And I've said that so many times. My kids know it's coming. I say, never give up, and they're like, never surrender. They've got it. But this is something that I want them to learn, because it is a kingdom principle. I don't care if it was in the script of a movie. This is what God says to us. He says, don't give up, don't surrender. We have to not grow weary in doing good so that we can reap a harvest. So let's talk about cars and houses. Like I said, you know, everybody needs transportation in our society. In some places, it's really good. You can catch the bus and it works. Or there's the subway or the metro, or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes you can't do that. When you live out in the middle of Nebraska and it's cornfields all around, you kind of have to have a car to get from the country to the city just to go to the grocery store or school, in my case, when I was growing up. You need transportation. You need a way to get there. But you know, car debt in our society is one of the biggest pitfalls. Do you know why? It's because it's cyclical. You buy a new car, and before you're done paying it off, you have to trade it in to get another new car. And before you're done paying it off, you trade it in to get another new car. And the amazing thing about cars is they don't appreciate in value. You buy a new car, you drive off the lot, it loses 50% of its value. Bam. But you're still paying that 50% because you borrowed it. So you're like, I'm driving a car that's worth half of what I already owe on it. Wow, this is why I never owned a new car. I never realized I was that smart. I didn't do it on purpose. I just went, what can I afford to buy? It's not that car. It's, oh, hey, there's my ABC car. I wasn't that smart, guys, honestly. But you can be that smart. Hey, I'm not saying never buy a new car either. I want you to hear this. Buy a new car if you need one. But don't do it before you're finished paying on the old one. That's just something I recommend there, you know. If look at your budget, pray, find out what you can afford. You never know what kind of miracles happen. God, we really need a car. God, we really need a second car. God, we know you're the great provider. And you know what? Sometimes miraculously, cars appear. I mean, really, literally, I've been there. When you've had a need, and you know that your bank account does not add up to a new car, you get together with God, you come to Him in prayer, you make your plans with Him, and His math suddenly adds up to a car, and you're going, what happened? He does things like that, guys. He does. But I'm not saying He does that every time you need Him to, because we have a part in this. Let's talk about houses too. Oh wait, no, I want to finish talking about cars. You know, here's some practical things you can do. If you do get a car, hey, pay off your loan and keep it for an extra 3 years after you finish paying off the loan. Because after that last payment, you know what you can do with that car payment? You can start putting that in savings for the next car you have to buy, because you're always going to need to replace your car. There are some things in your life you're just going to need to replace. Your clothes are going to wear out. We're not the Israelites walking around in the desert. God is not miraculously keeping our clothes from getting holes in them. You will have to replace your clothes. Plan on it. Unless you're a really good mechanic, your car probably won't last 20 years. You're probably going to have to replace it at some point. If you don't have to replace it, you're going to have to repair it. So you should plan on it. So one of the ways you can do that is don't stop paying for your car, even though your car is paid off. Pay ahead on the next car. And then when you're ready, take that car that's already paid off and get some money out of it. Remember I talked about if you're not going to use stuff, sell it? Hey, this is a great thing to do with cars. I've done that with cars too. Our car we need to replace it. We can't take it to a dealer because it's not going to be worth anything. But I know somebody will give me $500 at least for this old car that has some issues. Because there's somebody who really needs a car and all they've got is $500 cash. But they know how to fix cars, and they're willing to put some time into it. Do that. Or if it's in good shape, take it to the dealer and trade it in on a new car. Use it. You invested in that automobile. You paid it off. Use it. It's a resource. And I want to encourage you to buy what you can afford. Buy what you can afford. And I'm not talking, I can afford this much a month for 8 years. Don't think like that, because I did at one point. Think, how much can I afford total? And then look for cars like that. Don't look at how much can I afford a month, because you never know what your situation is going to be tomorrow. So just be prudent. Be prudent. And just keep that cycle of saving for the future purchases. When you get out of debt with your first automobile and you're getting ready to buy your second one, if you have to borrow a little bit, keep that same idea. I'm going to pay off the debt as soon as I can. I'm going to keep saving once I pay it off for the next purchase. And eventually, you'll find you're out of that cyclical thing with car debt. You've broken that cycle, and now suddenly you're walking in a dealer and saying, yeah, I like that car. Oh, no, that's too much. How about I pay cash? And they go, what? It stops them in their tracks because they're not used to it in our society. And you have a lot more bargaining power. You do. Let's talk about mortgages. Mortgages are complicated. How many of you know that? Yes. I have owned houses and I have rented. Renting is simple. How much do I owe you this month? Buying a house is complicated, but there's a reason for it. And I'm not going to expect that you guys are going to know everything about, I'm not going to talk about everything about mortgages, but I do recommend, find a reliable loan officer to really educate you on that if you do decide we want to own, because sometimes that is a good choice. In most 30-year loans, which is what most people get for houses, you're paying most of the interest up front and very little toward the actual price of the house. The bank's getting its money first. I'm so surprised. Remember, I told you, bankers were smart. They know this. And even with your houses, they know how to squeeze for their money. And that's how they look at it. My money. But we know that God has resources that they don't know about. So approach it with that respect. Maybe God's asking you to purchase a home that's going to be a legacy for your children. I don't know. God does. But that's dreaming with God for the long game. When God brought Abraham to where Israel was going to be, And he promised him that his children would be as numerous as the sand on the sea and the stars in the sky. Abraham didn't own anything in that land, except he bought a burial plot for his wife. And he had a bill of sale for it. And he passed that on to his kids. And they started with that. And they held on to it and said, this is the promise. This is the crack in the door for what God's going to open. And we see generations later, they came back and they had a homeland. They had a home because God promised it to them. So you don't know what you're sowing now that will be reaped in generations to come. And maybe that has to do with a home. I don't know. But some of these same principles apply. Buy what you can afford, not what the bank approves you for. I had to learn this one the hard way. We moved to Texas, and we needed a place to live. And remember, we still had a house in Nebraska. I was telling you guys about this, and we wound up going bankrupt over that. But we were looking for a house. We were making payments on the house in Nebraska still. We actually got a renter who was covering the payments and the mortgage and the management fees. So it was great. We're like, okay, we can look for a house here. We went to the bank, and the banker said, you can afford to borrow this much. And we went, awesome. We started looking for houses that cost that much money. And then we looked at what we would pay every month, and we went, we won't eat if we do that. So we realized that we couldn't buy what we were approved for. We had to sit down with God, and we had to say, God, what can we afford? And we got a lovely home in Texas that we were into and paying on, and we were, good before the whole train wreck of the collapse and our disastrous encounter with the bank and the bankruptcy. We still had a home. God saw to it that we had a home, and it was a lovely home that we could afford and we could continue to afford. So he took care of us. Consider what is reasonable for a monthly mortgage payment. Let that drive what you purchase. Consider a short-term loan if you can do it. If you can afford slightly higher payments, you usually can save significantly on interest. If you get a shorter-term loan, generally they'll give you a lower interest rate, but you'll also pay it faster and be out of debt quicker. Talk to the loan officer about it. They know how to educate you on that, because I just made it really simple, and it's not that simple. If you can, add something to your required payment and make sure, check with your bank, make sure that it goes towards your principal. Because if you're paying down the principal, you actually owe less money, you pay less interest, the bank makes less money. And you begin to invest with God in the inheritance that He's building in that home that you're making for your family. And don't be afraid to get radical. Hey, if you get a bonus or a tax return, you can put that to work too. Give God what He's due, but then use that for extra oomph. That's what we would do. We'd pay down debt. We'd put extra money away when we actually had a tax return or a bonus. God knows those things are coming, even if you don't sometimes. Don't plan on those things to happen. But boy, if God gives you a windfall, if there's a gift that He sends to you, if you're praying for a way out and He sends it, use it. Because you're working together with Him. We've already talked about how in the kingdom, it's opposite from culture. It's upside down. There are principles and things that God wants us to grow and change in our hearts about. And one of these things is our obligations. Pay your debts. A lot of people, they wait as long as possible to pay their bills. Sometimes that's necessary, but sometimes it's people trying to be crafty. I'm going to keep my money in the bank earning interest until I absolutely have to pay this thing. Sometimes they'll go past the due date because they're playing the numbers like that. That's gambling with God's resources, really. But you know, God's kingdom is upside down from that. Proverbs 3:27 and 28 says this. It says, don't withhold good from someone who deserves it when it is in your power to do so. Don't say to your neighbor, go and come back, I'll give it to you tomorrow, if you have it, or when you have it. So this is what this means, guys. It's real easy. If you have the money to pay the bill, pay the bill. If you don't have the money to pay the bill, then you need to work with the person that you're obligated to for that debt. But if you have the money, don't withhold it, because God blesses your commitment and your heart. If they are due what they come looking for, if they deserve it, give it to them. Because at that point, since you borrowed it, it's not really yours, it's theirs. This just sounds right, you know? It makes sense. Gee, God's really smart. I hope you guys have figured that out already. If you're way past due, work something out. Contact your creditors, get on the ball. You know, we did this when we were waiting to adjudicate for bankruptcy. We did this when our credit when our interest rates jumped from like 2% to 33%. I spent hours on the phone with banks. Hey, look, can you please look at our payment history with you? Can you look at our history with you? This is wrong, what's happened. Can you please correct it? Oh, I can't help you. Can I please speak with your supervisor? I was very kind. But I was persistent. Finally, I would get to someone who could help me, and they would pull up our record and say, yeah, we see you've been paying consistently every month, and you've been paying more than the minimum amount. And I'd talk to them. I'd say, yeah, actually, my wife and I were trying to pay off our debts. And we're on a very tight budget. We actually had a budget. We were following it. I said, when you raise your interest rates from 2% to 33%, our payment went from $50 a month to $500 a month. I only have $70 a month to pay this bill. You're not going to get your $500. Is there something you can do? And we worked with the people, and you know what happened is they were like, yeah, sure, we'll readjust your interest rate. And the person changed it back to 2%. Now, the next month I had to do the same thing again because a credit was wrecked, and a bank is a really big organism, and somebody over here was adjusting interest rates, and the people that I was talking to were over here fixing interest rates. And that was why we got a lawyer and said, we need some help, because I can't spend 6 hours on the phone every time this happens with however many creditors I had, which I'm not telling you because it was more than enough. So you can work with people. You know, people will work with you if you're polite, if you come with a humble heart, and you say, look, I'm really trying to make sure you get your money. I'm really trying to be responsible. I need some help. This is what I can do, and they will work with you. And if you're a young person and you have student loans, the same thing applies. I know because I still have student loans. I'm not so young anymore. I don't know if you noticed that. So anybody can be in that situation, but you know, when you talk to them and you say, look, I want to make sure you get what's due to you. How can I work with you? Many people, most of them, are happy to help you because, you know, they want to get their money out of you. They want to get paid back. And if they know you're really going to meet that obligation, they'll work with you. Especially if you have a good history with them. Now, dealing with debt, it's hard, but you know, nothing is impossible with God. You get with Him, you make a game plan. You are not in this alone. He's got your back. He is watching out for you. And He says, never give up, never surrender. That's what Galatians 6:9 says. Do not grow weary. Don't give up. The principle of reaping a harvest that you sowed is a real, tangible application It has value in God's kingdom. Practice it and see what happens with God. You will be amazed. Remember, too, that the only debt that you should owe someone is the obligation to love them like God loves them. When you start there and you get all of the other things in line in your heart and your mind, you will be amazed at the things that start to happen. I really want to encourage you this week as you go through the material and you go back and you go through it and you do the study that's in the workbook and you look at the questions at the end of the chapter. Don't skip over that last practical application. This is where you can really start to plan with God, because the first thing you need to do is you need to look at, what do I owe? Because sometimes we really don't know. But it's important that you do that. The practical application for this week is tackling your personal debt. And really what it is it's sitting down and it's being real about what you owe to everyone. Creditors, relatives, friends. Be honest with God, because He's got a plan to help you out. You're not doing it alone. He has blessings for you when you collaborate with Him. He wants you to reap a good harvest. So we're going to close tonight here. Can I ask everybody to stand up? I just want to pray over the harvest God has for you. Father, I thank you that you are a provider. I just thank you that you have given us good gifts, that you continue to sustain us and meet our needs. Father, I just pray over all of those who are gathered here tonight and those who are watching the recording, the online, Lord. I just pray your blessing would pour over them, that as they sow with you in the kingdom, that the harvest that you bring will be great. That what they sow in effort will bring a bountiful blessing. That what they sow in finances will bring a harvest of finances, Lord. I just pray that you will bless them as they press in for more of you and as they spread your love in all they do, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.